The air in family courtroom 3B was thick enough to choke on a stale perfume of regret and expensive cologne. On one side sat Richard Sterling, a man whose net worth was splashed across financial magazines, looking as polished and unforgiving as the marble floors. Beside him, his mistress, Amber Lynn, practically vibrated with triumphant bliss, her youth, a stark, cruel contrast to the solemnity of the room. They were a portrait of a foregone conclusion. But then the Honorable Judge David Thompson, a man with eyes that had seen every shade of human folly, cleared his throat. "Before we proceed," he announced, his voice echoing in the sudden silence, "the court is in receipt of a letter from the defendant, Mrs. Elena Sterling." A ripple of confusion. Richard's jaw tightened. A letter. What game was she playing now? He was about to find out that his wife's final move wasn't a plea for reconciliation. It was a declaration of war he never saw coming. The sterile wood-paneled walls of the courtroom felt like a personal insult to Richard Sterling. He was a man accustomed to boardrooms that smelled of leather and ambition, to private jets that hummed with the promise of another conquered market. This place with its worn benches and the faint scent of disinfectant was for common failures, not for titans like him. He smoothed the lapel of his Tom Ford suit, a silent act of defiance against the mediocrity of his surroundings. His lawyer, Marcus Thorne, a man whose tailored suits were as sharp as his legal tactics, had assured him this would be a formality. A clean break, he'd called it. Richard had provided a generous settlement offer, one that would allow his soon-to-be ex-wife Elena to live in comfort for the rest of her life. It was more than fair. It was magnanimous, he thought. After all, he was the architect of their fortune. He had built Sterling Tech Solutions from a garage startup into a global powerhouse. Elena had been there. A supportive presence in the beginning, yes, but she had failed to evolve with him. While he soared into the stratosphere of wealth and influence, she remained tethered to the ground, content with her quiet life, her books, and her garden. He glanced at Amber seated beside him. She gave his hand a reassuring squeeze, her diamond bracelet a recent gift catching the fluorescent light. Amber was everything Elena was not. She was vibrant, exciting, and utterly enthralled by the world he had built. She understood the demands of his life, the necessity of attending galas in Monaco, of networking on yachts in the Caribbean. She didn't complain when he worked 100-hour weeks. She celebrated the results, posting their glamorous life to her hundreds of thousands of followers with breathless enthusiasm. She was a partner for his new life, not a relic of his old one. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed. Judge David Thompson entered, his black robe flowing behind him like a dark tide. He settled into his high-backed chair, his gaze sweeping over the room before landing on Richard's party. There was no flicker of recognition or awe, a fact that subtly annoyed Richard. The judge picked up a file, his expression unreadable. "We are here today to hear the petition for the dissolution of the marriage between Richard Sterling, petitioner, and Elena Sterling, respondent." Judge Thompson began, his voice dry and official. "Mr. Thorne, you may begin." Marcus Thorne stood, a portrait of smooth confidence. "Your Honor, we are here to finalize what we hope will be an amicable and swift divorce. Mr. Sterling has made a settlement offer that is by any standard exceptionally generous. It provides Mrs. Sterling with the marital home, a significant lump sum payment, and lifelong alimony. We have filed a motion for default judgment as the respondent has not formally replied to the petition within the allotted time frame." Richard allowed himself a small internal smile. Default judgment. It was perfect. Elena hadn't even bothered to hire a lawyer. It was so typical of her, passive, non-confrontational. She was probably at home tending to her precious roses, resigned to her fate. He felt a pang of something, not quite guilt, but a faint echo of pity. It was for the best. She would be happier without the pressure of his world, and he would be free. Judge Thompson listened intently, his fingers steepled. He did not look at the file. When Thorne finished, the judge remained silent for a long moment. The clock on the wall ticked each second, amplifying the tension in the room. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said finally, his voice low and deliberate, You state the respondent has not replied. That is not entirely accurate. Thorne's confident posture faltered for a fraction of a second. Your Honor, we have received no communication from any legal counsel representing Mrs. Sterling. I am aware, the judge said, his eyes now fixed on Richard. That is because Mrs. Sterling did not write to you. She wrote to me. He lifted a single cream-colored envelope from his desk. It was sealed with wax in anachronistic detail that seemed strangely fitting for Elena. Richard's blood ran cold. What could she possibly have written? A pathetic plea, an emotional rant. It was humiliating. This is highly irregular, Your Honor, Thorne interjected, recovering his composure. Any and all correspondence should be filed through the proper legal channels. Ordinarily, I would agree. Judge Thompson conceded, his gaze unwavering. However, given the unique contents of this letter and the fact that Mrs. Sterling has cited specific reasons for her absence from these proceedings, I have decided to allow it. It was delivered by courier this morning with instructions that it be read in open court in the event of a hearing for a default judgment. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Which is precisely where we find ourselves. Richard's heart began to hammer against his ribs. This was a calculated move. This wasn't passive Elena. This was something different. Beside him, Amber shifted uncomfortably, her perfect smile replaced by a frown of confusion. Mr. Sterling, the judge said, his tone now devoid of any judicial neutrality. It was the voice of a man about to deliver a verdict on something far more significant than a marriage. I suggest you listen very carefully. He carefully broke the wax seal, unfolded the letter, and began to read. The world as Richard Sterling knew it was about to be set on fire. Before the Patek Philippe watch and the private jets, there was a cramped apartment above a laundromat that always smelled of damp clothes and bleach. Before Sterling Tech Solutions was a name that made Wall Street tremble, it was a mess of wires and motherboards on a fold-out table in the living room. And before Amber Lynn, there was Elena. They had met in a university library. He was a frantic, brilliant computer science major fueled by caffeine and a burning desire to create something that would change the world. She was a literature student with quiet eyes and a smile that could calm the frantic energy that always buzzed beneath his skin. She didn't just tolerate his obsession, she nurtured it. When he was broke, she'd buy groceries with her waitressing money. When his code crashed at 3 a.m., she'd make him tea and listen her head on his shoulder as he explained complex algorithms she didn't understand but supported with unwavering faith. You're going to do it, Rich, she'd whisper into the dark. You're going to build the future. He had loved her with a ferocity that surprised him. She was his anchor, his muse. Her belief in him was the silent essential code running in the background of his life. Their first date night after they were married was spent on the floor of that apartment, sharing a $10 pizza and sketching out the architecture for his first major project on a greasy napkin. He called it Aura Connect. It's not just a connection, she had said, her finger tracing the design. It's about the feeling, the atmosphere it creates between people. It's like an aura. The name stuck. The first 5 years were a blur of struggle, sacrifice, and shared dreams. Every small victory was theirs. The day he secured his first round of seed funding, he didn't call his parents or his friends first. He called Elena. He could hear her shriek of joy through the phone, and they celebrated that night not with champagne but with the best bottle of $2 wine they could find. Then Aura Connect launched. It didn't just succeed, it exploded. The money started to pour in, first a steady stream, then a tidal wave. They moved out of the cramped apartment and into a modest house. Then a larger one. Then a sprawling glass-walled mansion in the hills overlooking the city. The fold-out table was replaced by a state-of-the-art office. The cheap wine was replaced by a cellar stocked with vintages Richard couldn't pronounce but knew were expensive. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the change began. The shared victories became his victories. I did it, Elena, he'd say, striding into the house, no longer looking for her but expecting her to be there. I closed the deal. The we that had been the foundation of their life eroded into I. The late nights working together turned into late nights he spent at the office alone, or with his new high-powered executive team. When she tried to talk to him about her day, a new book she was reading, a problem with the hydrangeas in her garden, he'd nod distractedly, his mind on stock prices and market expansion. "That's nice, honey," he'd say, his eyes glued to his phone. He started to see her as a part of the life he was leaving behind. She didn't fit in with the venture capitalists' wives who spoke of shopping trips to Paris and their children's equestrian lessons. Elena preferred museums to malls, libraries to lounges. He felt a sense of embarrassment which quickly curdled into resentment. She was a constant, gentle reminder of a past he now saw as humble and slightly shameful, rather than the foundation of his success. The final schism came a year ago at a charity gala. He had insisted she buy a new dress, hire a stylist. She had emerged in a simple, elegant navy gown that made her look timeless. But throughout the night he saw her through the eyes of his new peers. He saw her looking uncomfortable as a tech billionaire's wife bragged about her new yacht. He saw her politely disengage from a conversation about cryptocurrency. Later that night, Amber Lynn, a budding social media influencer hired by the event's PR firm, approached him. She was dazzling, effervescent, and hung on his every word about server capacity and user acquisition. She didn't just listen. She was impressed. Deeply, visibly impressed. When he spoke, her eyes lit up. For the first time in years, he felt not just successful, but seen, admired, worshipped. The affair began a week later. 2 months before he filed for divorce, Elena had come to him one evening, a strange, nervous light in her eyes. He was agitated, pacing the living room, barking into his phone at his legal team over a patent dispute. "Rich," she started, her voice soft. "Can we talk for a minute? It's important." "Not now, Elena," he snapped, waving a dismissive hand. "Can't you see I'm busy? This is $100 million problem." He walked out of the room, still yelling into the phone. He never saw the flicker of profound hurt in her eyes, or the way her hand instinctively went to her stomach. He never asked what was so important. A week later, he told her he was leaving her. He didn't even have the decency to do it in person, sending a cold, brief email followed by a call from Marcus Thorne. She didn't fight, she didn't scream, she didn't cry. At least not where he could see. She simply went silent. He took her silence for acceptance, for weakness. He never imagined it was the quiet gathering of a storm. He had forgotten the woman who had helped him name his company, the woman who understood that the right words delivered at the right time could be more powerful than any algorithm. He had forgotten that she was not just a relic of his past, but the co-author of his life story, a story she was now about to rewrite. Back in the courtroom, the air was utterly still. Judge Thompson held the pages in his hand, the paper a stark white against the dark wood of his bench. Amber was fidgeting, her perfectly manicured nails tapping a frantic rhythm on her designer handbag. Richard sat ramrod straight, a statue of indignation, his mind racing. A letter, a desperate emotional ploy. He steeled himself for a litany of her pain, a catalog of his sins. It would be embarrassing, but ultimately meaningless. Then the judge began to read, and Elena's voice, clear and unwavering, filled the silent room. "Your Honor, and Richard." It began. The inclusion of his name was a direct hit, personal and immediate. "I am writing this letter because I cannot bring myself to be in that room. Not out of fear or weakness, but out of a profound sense of dignity. The courtroom is a place for disputes, but what has happened to our marriage is not a dispute. It is a demolition. And I will not sit and watch as the man I once loved stands beside the woman who holds the wrecking ball." A quiet gasp rippled through the few observers in the gallery. Richard felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. Amber recoiled as if struck. "Richard, I am sure you are sitting there in your finest suit, looking at your watch, impatient to get this over with so you can return to your important life. You see this as closing a chapter, but you cannot close a chapter without first reading it. Do you remember our first apartment? The one where the heating was so bad we had to wear sweaters to bed in October. You were working on a dream, and I was working 2 jobs to keep the lights on. We didn't have money, but we had everything. We were a team. That shared dream built an empire, Richard. An empire you now call solely your own. Richard's knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the table. These were private memories, sacred things being aired out in this cold public space. It was a violation. Your lawyer will speak of your generosity. The letter continued, the judge's voice steady. He will list the assets you are giving me. The house that has felt empty for years. The money that cannot buy back a single moment of your time. You believe you are being fair, but there is a debt you have incurred that cannot be repaid with stocks or wire transfers. It's a debt of loyalty, of shared history. It is the mortgage on our past, and you are trying to foreclose on it. Thorne shifted on his feet, his professional mask cracking. This was not the rambling of a scorned woman. This was a precise, eloquent indictment. I'm not writing to contest the divorce. A marriage is not a contract. It is a living thing. And ours, I'm afraid, died of neglect long ago. I am writing to inform the court and to inform you of a new stakeholder in the Sterling legacy. A silent partner you have until this moment been completely unaware of. The judge paused, took a slow breath, and looked directly at Richard. The air in the room grew thin, charged with an almost unbearable suspense. 2 months ago, the evening you were so agitated about a patent dispute, I tried to tell you something. You waved me away. You said you were busy with a $100 million problem. You were right, it was a busy night. You were securing your fortune. And I was at home holding a positive pregnancy test, trying to find the right moment to tell you that we were about to have a family. The words dropped into the courtroom like stones into a deep, silent well. Richard's mind went blank. Pregnant. The word echoed in the sudden roaring silence of his own head. He felt the blood drain from his face. Beside him, Amber let out a small strangled sound. Her face was a mask of disbelief and horror. The judge continued, his voice now carrying a new weight, a tone of profound gravity. I am 5 months pregnant, Richard. With your son. A collective audible gasp swept the room. Thorne looked at his client, his face pale. This changed everything. A simple divorce had just become a minefield of paternity, child support of an unimaginable scale, and a public relations nightmare. You see, you are not just divorcing a wife who became inconvenient. Elena's letter concluded each word a hammer blow. You are attempting to sever ties with a child. Your heir. The true successor to the Sterling name. I am not asking for more money for myself. I want nothing from you. But for our son, I will demand everything. He will have his birthright. He will have his legacy. And that legacy includes the truth. The judge lowered the first page and picked up the second. Richard thought it couldn't get any worse. He was wrong. And as for the truth, let's start with Aura Connect, your great solo achievement. I have in my possession, Your Honor, the original notebooks from our apartment, the ones filled with my handwriting as well as Richard's. The notebooks where I sketched the initial logo. The notebooks where on page 17, in my own words, I wrote, "It's not just a connection. It's an aura." I will not allow my son's father to be a man who built his empire on a lie of soul creation. I will not fight you for your money, Richard. I will fight you for your story. And it's a fight, I assure you, you will lose. Judge Thompson placed the letter down on his bench. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Richard Sterling's world shattering into a million irreparable pieces. He stared forward, seeing nothing, the arrogant millionaire replaced by a man utterly and completely exposed. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to physically jolt Richard back into his body. This court is adjourned for 1 week. Judge Thompson declared, his voice ringing with an authority that was no longer just legal but moral. He fixed Richard with a glare of pure ice. Mr. Sterling, I suggest you get your house in order. It appears to be a far more complicated structure than you previously believed. Mr. Thorne, I expect to hear from you or your client's new counsel promptly. With a final withering look, the judge swept out of the courtroom. For a moment, no one moved. The reporters in the back, who had been lazily taking notes on a routine high society divorce, were now frantically whispering into their phones. The story had just gone from a gossip column filler to a front-page bombshell. Richard was frozen, the letter's words still exploding in his mind. Pregnant. Your son. My handwriting. Page 17. It was a series of tactical nuclear strikes against the foundations of his life. He felt a dizzying vertigo, the polished floor seeming to tilt beneath his feet. Richard. Amber's voice was sharp, cutting through his stupor. It lacked its usual syrupy sweetness. It was brittle with panic. A baby. What is she talking about? You said she was just old news. He turned to look at her, but his eyes were unfocused. I didn't know. He stammered the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. It was the truth, but it sounded like the weakest lie he'd ever told. You didn't know, she hissed, her voice low and furious. How could you not know? People don't just accidentally have a baby on the way, Richard. You lied to me. You told me it was over, that it was clean. The dream she had bought into a life of glamour and carefree luxury with a powerful man was dissolving before her eyes into a nightmare of screaming infants, custody battles, and public humiliation. She was supposed to be the new, shiny future, not a footnote in a sordid family drama. Marcus, Richard croaked, ignoring Amber and turning to his lawyer. Fix this. Marcus Thorne looked ashen. He was wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief, his usual unflappable demeanor gone. Fix this, he repeated, his voice strained. Richard, this isn't a parking ticket. This is a 5-alarm fire. A paternity claim from a legal wife changes the entire financial landscape. We're talking about child support calculated against your full income. We're talking trust's inheritance rights. And this intellectual property claim about Aura Connect. If she has proof. He trailed off, the implication hanging in the air. The Aura Connect origin story was legend. Richard Sterling, the lone genius coding in his garage. It was the cornerstone of his personal brand, a narrative worth billions in public perception and investor confidence. If Elena could prove she was a co-creator, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It could be grounds for a lawsuit that could challenge the very ownership structure of his company. She's bluffing, Richard said, more to convince himself than anyone else. The notebooks, they're just scribbles. It means nothing. It means everything to a jury, Richard. Thorne snapped, his frustration boiling over. A jilted wife with handwritten proof up against a billionaire trying to abandon his pregnant wife for a younger model. Who do you think they'll believe? This is no longer a divorce proceeding. We are now in a war for your reputation and a significant percentage of your net worth. Suddenly, the courtroom doors opened again. A woman in a sharp, dark gray pantsuit with a leather briefcase strode in. She had an air of calm, lethal competence. She walked directly up to them. Marcus, she said, her voice cool and even. I thought I might find you here. Thorne's face went a shade paler. Amelia, what are you doing here? My client, Mrs. Elena Sterling, asked me to deliver this in person, the woman said, her eyes flicking briefly to Richard before dismissing him. She handed Thorne a thick envelope. It's a revised settlement proposal. I think you'll find it comprehensive. We've also filed a motion to dismiss your request for a default judgment and have formally entered my appearance as counsel. We will see you back here in a week. Try to be better prepared this time. She gave a curt nod and turned her heels, clicking decisively on the marble floor as she exited. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made a single threat, but her message was terrifyingly clear. The game had changed, and Elena was no longer playing alone. Richard stared at the envelope in Thorne's trembling hand as if it were a bomb. Amelia Vance. He knew that name. She was one of the most feared litigators in the state, known for taking on corporate giants and winning. I have to go, Amber said abruptly. She stood up, grabbing her purse. Her face was a storm of anger and fear. I can't be a part of this. Amber, wait, Richard pleaded, reaching for her. She snatched her arm away. "Don't touch me," she spat. "You have a baby on the way, Richard. A whole secret family. Do you have any idea how this makes me look? Call me when your life isn't a complete and utter train wreck." She turned and fled, her hurried footsteps echoing her panic. Richard watched her go, the final pillar of his new life crumbling away. He was left standing in the wreckage of the courtroom with a shell-shocked lawyer and an envelope that held the blueprint for his dismantling. For the first time since he was a teenager eating cheap pizza on a dirty floor, Richard Sterling felt utterly terrifyingly alone, and for the first time, he was afraid. The week that followed was the longest of Richard Sterling's life. The story leaked from the courtroom became a media firestorm. The headlines were brutal. Sterling's shock heir tech mogul's divorce explodes with baby bombshell. The aura of deceit. Founder's ex-wife claims role in creation of tech giant. His carefully curated public image of a self-made visionary was being sledgehammered into dust, replaced by the portrait of a callous, lying adulterer. His company's stock took a nervous dip. His board of directors called an emergency meeting, their voices a mixture of panic and accusation. The narrative was everything in their business, and he had single-handedly torpedoed it. He tried to call Elena. Dozens of times. Each call went directly to her voicemail, her calm recorded voice a tormenting reminder of the woman he had so thoroughly underestimated. He drove to their house, but the gates were closed. A new security detail was posted at the entrance, and they had firm instructions. Mr. Sterling was not to be admitted. He was locked out of his own home, a king exiled from his kingdom. The envelope from Amelia Vance contained not a settlement proposal but a declaration of terms. It was cold, precise, and devastating. It demanded a 30% stake in Sterling Tech Solutions to be placed in an irrevocable trust for their son, Christopher James. Sterling Elena had already named him. It demanded a public statement from the company and from Richard personally acknowledging Elena Sterling's foundational contributions to the conception and branding of Aura Connect. It also included high-resolution scans of several pages from the notebooks. There it was in crisp, undeniable detail, flowcharts, brainstorming notes, and on page 17, her elegant cursive script outlining the Aura concept. "It's ironclad, Richard," Marcus Thorne said, his voice heavy with defeat. They were in Thorne's office, the documents spread across a vast mahogany desk. "Her claims are not just credible, they're provable. Amelia Vance has us cornered. If we fight this and it goes to discovery, they'll subpoena every email, every server, every employee from the early days. The story will only get worse. We have to negotiate." Richard was a man who never negotiated. He dictated. He crushed his opposition. But now he had no leverage. He was staring at a gun, and Elena's finger was on the trigger. The rage that had sustained him began to curdle into a hollow, gnawing despair. He tried to call Amber again. This time the call wouldn't even go through. He checked her social media. Her feed, once filled with pictures of them on his jet and at lavish parties, had been scrubbed clean. Every trace of him was gone, deleted as easily as a temporary file. He had been an accessory to her lifestyle, and when he became a liability, he was simply discarded. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. He had done the exact same thing to Elena. Days blurred into a haze of frantic meetings with lawyers and PR consultants. They advised him to settle to get ahead of the story, to show contrition. Contrition. The word felt foreign on his tongue. He had spent the last decade believing he was infallible. The reckoning came not in a courtroom, but in the sterile silence of his penthouse apartment, the one he'd bought for his new life with Amber. It was a monument to his success, with panoramic views of the city he believed he owned, but now it felt like a prison. Surrounded by modern art he didn't understand, and furniture that was more beautiful than comfortable, he felt the crushing weight of his isolation. He found himself wandering into the spare bedroom, a room he had mentally designated as a future office. His mind, unbidden, conjured an image of it as a nursery, a crib, a mobile hanging from the ceiling, A son he had never met, had never even known existed, who would grow up bearing his name, but knowing him only as the man who tried to abandon him before he was born. He finally broke. It wasn't a dramatic, screaming breakdown, but a quiet, complete implosion. He sank onto the floor, his back against a cold glass wall, and for the first time since he was a child, Richard Sterling wept. He wept for the woman whose faith he had betrayed, for the son he had almost disowned, and for the man he had become, a man so blinded by the glare of his own success that he couldn't see the real treasures he was throwing away. The next morning, he called Marcus Thorne. "Set up the meeting with Amelia Vance," he said, his voice hoarse. "Give them what they want. Trust the statement. All of it." There was a pause on the other end. "All of it?" Thorne asked, surprised. "All of it," Richard repeated. "It's time to pay the debt." The weeks following the court hearing were a blur of controlled demolition. Richard Sterling, the man who moved markets with a single interview, was now the subject of a brutal public dissection. The first casualty was his authority. He walked into an emergency board meeting at Sterling Tech to face not a room of acolytes but a tribunal of anxious investors. The deference was gone, replaced by the cold calculus of damage control. His longtime COO Peterson, a man who had ridden Richard's coattails to immense wealth, was the one to deliver the verdict. "The brand is hemorrhaging, Richard," he said, foregoing any pleasantries. "The lone genius narrative is toxic. The market can forgive arrogance. It can't forgive being made to feel foolish. We need a new story. You need to fix this, and you need to do it yesterday." It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. The message was clear. He was no longer the untouchable king, but a liability they were forced to manage. The legal surrender was just as swift and humiliating. He sat opposite Amelia Vance in a sterile conference room, the air thick with the scent of paper and defeat. Marcus Thorne. His own lawyer was subdued, his usual bravado replaced by a grim pragmatism. Amelia Vance was a study in cool efficiency. She didn't gloat. She simply laid out the terms, the trust, the public acknowledgement, the intellectual property assignment, as if discussing a weather report. Richard listened, his hands clasped on the table to keep them from shaking. This was the antithesis of every negotiation he'd ever conducted. He had no leverage, no counteroffer, no position of power from which to dictate terms. He was a king in checkmate. When Amelia finished, a profound silence filled the room. Marcus looked at him, waiting for the inevitable command to fight to find a loophole. Instead, Richard took a deep breath. "Draw up the papers," he said, his voice raspy. "Give her everything she asked for." The words felt like stones in his mouth, but also strangely like a release. It was the first decision he had made in weeks that wasn't born of ego, but of a grim acceptance of the truth. With the legal and professional battles conceded, Richard retreated to his penthouse. He had bought it as a monument to his new life, a glass fortress in the sky. It now felt like a gilded prison. The panoramic views of the city he once saw as his kingdom now seemed to mock him, showcasing a world that was moving on without him. The silence was the loudest thing in the room, broken only by the hum of the climate control. He tried once to reach out. He scrolled through his contacts, a list of the most powerful names in finance, tech, and media. He called 3 of them, men he had shared $100,000 bottles of wine with on yachts. His calls were met with the polite, impenetrable wall of their executive assistants. "Mr. Bancroft is in a meeting. Mr. Chen is traveling indefinitely. I'll be sure to pass along the message." The messages were never returned. His social value had plummeted alongside his company's stock. He was a contagion, and no one wanted to risk infection. One evening, staring out at the glittering cityscape, he finally allowed the full weight of his failure to land. He had achieved everything he had set out to do. He was wealthier and more powerful than he had ever dreamed, and he was utterly, profoundly alone. He thought of Elena. Her victory wasn't just in her clever legal strategy. She had won because she was fighting for something real, a child, a legacy of truth. He had been fighting for a hollow public image, a story he had started to believe himself. In the end, there was no contest. His life became a Spartan routine of work and solitude. The fire of ambition had been extinguished, leaving behind the cold ashes of regret. Then one crisp autumn afternoon, as he sat staring blankly at a stock ticker, his phone buzzed. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize. There were no words, just the name of a hospital and a room number, St. Jude's Hospital, room 312. His heart seized in his chest. A cold electric shock jolted him from his stupor. He didn't have to ask who it was from or why. He grabbed his car keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely fit the key in the ignition. The drive to the hospital was a frantic blur, his mind a chaotic storm of fear and a desperate, unfamiliar hope. What would he say? What if she turned him away? He found the maternity ward at the end of a long, quiet corridor. The air smelled of antiseptic and baby powder. Each step toward room 312 felt heavier than the last. He paused at the door, which was slightly ajar. Taking a breath that did little to calm his hammering heart, he pushed it open. The room was bathed in the soft afternoon light, and there, sitting in a chair by the window, was Elena. She looked tired, but a deep, unshakable serenity radiated from her. In her arms, wrapped in a simple blue blanket, was a tiny sleeping baby. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. There was no anger, no triumph, just a calm, weary acknowledgement of his presence. This disarmed him more than any outburst could have. Elena. He whispered the name, a prayer on his lips. Richard. She replied, her voice soft but steady. Come in? He approached slowly, as if drawn by an invisible force, his eyes locked on the small bundle in her arms. The baby had a dusting of dark hair, a tiny, perfect mouth. His son. Christopher. A tidal wave of emotion, regret, awe, and a fierce primal love crashed over him, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. Can I? He asked, his voice thick with unshed tears. Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching his eyes for the man he had been, and perhaps for a glimpse of the man he could become. After a lifetime of a moment, she nodded. With careful, practiced movements, she adjusted the bundle and held him out. Richard's hands trembled as he took his son. The baby was impossibly light, yet he felt like the heaviest, most substantial thing he had ever held. Christopher stirred, his tiny fingers uncurling, and then instinctively gripping one of Richard's. In that instant, the abstract concept of his son, the legal problem, the heir, the consequence evaporated. This was his child. This was flesh and blood. This was real. He looked at Elena, his eyes conveying a universe of apologies he didn't yet have the words for. He's perfect, he managed to say. Thank you. It was a hopelessly inadequate phrase for the grace she was showing him. He deserves a father, Richard, she said quietly. Her words not a weapon but a simple statement of fact. Whether or not you can become one is up to you. The challenge hung in the air, a stark and daunting path laid out before him. It was not an offer of reconciliation, nor was it a final rejection. It was a door cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of light. Richard Sterling stood there holding his son, a billionaire who had just discovered the profound, terrifying, and exhilarating meaning of true wealth. He had lost his kingdom, his reputation, and his friends. But in the quiet of that hospital room, holding his entire world in his arms, he realized he had just been given a chance to gain something infinitely more valuable, a soul. The first time Richard visited the house, Elena's house now, he felt like a foreign diplomat navigating hostile territory. He arrived armed not with legal briefs, but with gifts so extravagant they were obscene. A miniature drivable electric Bentley for a 1-month-old. A cashmere layette from a designer whose name was whispered in hushed tones on Rodeo Drive. A high-tech smart crib that promised to analyze sleep patterns and automatically soothe the baby with algorithmically perfect rocking motions. Elena met him at the door, Christopher nestled in a simple cotton sling against her chest. She looked at the mountain of glossy bags and boxes on her porch with an expression that was not angry but weary. "He's a baby, Richard," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "He needs warmth, not wealth. He needs a father, not a financier." She didn't refuse the gifts, but she didn't gush over them either. She led him into the living room where the expensive sterile furniture he'd once chosen had been softened with handmade quilts and stacks of board books. The house felt less like a showroom and more like a home. The smart crib remained in its box. Instead, a simple wooden bassinet stood by the sofa. This set the pattern for the months that followed. Richard's initial attempts at fatherhood were a case study in ineptitude. He was a man who could command a room of 1,000 engineers, but the explosive reality of a diaper change left him pale and fumbling. He could anticipate market trends years in advance, but he couldn't decipher the subtle cues that distinguished a cry of hunger from a cry of discomfort. He tried to solve parenting like a business problem by throwing resources at it. When Christopher developed a minor rash, Richard's first instinct was to get on the phone. "I'll have a pediatric dermatologist flown in from Boston," he announced, already dialing. Elena calmly took the phone from his hand and ended the call. "Or," she said, her patience stretched thin, "we could try the cream his actual pediatrician recommended, the one who lives 10 minutes from here. Your checkbook is not a miracle cure, Richard." He felt the hot sting of shame. He was used to his money being the ultimate solution, the master key that opened any door. Here it was a clumsy, oversized tool useless for the delicate work required. Elena wasn't just being difficult. She was teaching him a new language. One where presence mattered more than power, and patience was a more valuable currency than dollars. She set strict boundaries. He had scheduled visiting hours Tuesdays and Thursdays from 5 to 7 p.m., and Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. He was not to be late. He was not to cancel, unless it was a true emergency. At first, his old life fought viciously against this new structure. One Tuesday, an emergency board meeting was called to discuss a hostile takeover bid. It was an all-hands-on-deck crisis. His COO, a man named Peterson, called him in a panic. "Richard, we need you here. The preliminary vote is at 6 p.m. Your voice is critical." The old Richard wouldn't have hesitated. He would have lived at the office for a week, fueled by coffee and combat, and crushed the opposition. He looked at the clock. It was 4:45 p.m. He was due at Elena's in 15 minutes. He pictured Christopher, who had just started to master a clumsy, drooling smile that Richard was desperate to see again. "Peterson," Richard said, his voice startlingly calm, "you are the COO of a multi-billion-dollar company. You are more than capable of handling the preliminary discussion. Present our counter-strategy as planned. I will be available on my phone after 7:15 p.m. for an update, not a minute before." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "But, Richard, this is—" "I have a prior commitment that is non-negotiable," Richard said, and hung up the phone. He walked out of his office, leaving behind a bewildered executive team. He arrived at Elena's house at 5 p.m. on the dot. As he held his son that evening, feeling the infant's small, warm weight against his chest, he didn't feel a shred of regret about the missed meeting. The battle in the boardroom felt distant and insignificant compared to the quiet victory of being present in this room. He was learning. Slowly, painstakingly, things began to shift. He learned to listen not just to Elena's instructions, but to his son. He started leaving his phone in the car during his visits. He learned the specific way Christopher liked to be held when he was fussy. One Saturday, Elena watched as he expertly soothed a crying fit, patiently walking the floor with the baby on his shoulder, humming a tuneless melody, until the sobs subsided into soft, sleepy breaths. Later that day, she had to run an errand. "I'll be gone for about an hour," she said, hesitating at the door. It was the first time she had considered leaving them alone. "We'll be fine," Richard said, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of terror and pride. She looked at him, truly. Looked at him and saw not the arrogant mogul, but a man trying with every fiber of his being to get this one important thing right. She nodded. I know you will." When she returned, she found them both asleep on the large sofa, Christopher snuggled on his father's chest, Richard's hand resting protectively on his tiny back. A fragile seed of trust had been planted. The year culminated on Christopher's first birthday. It was not the grand affair Richard would have once orchestrated. There were no caterers, no pony rides, no army of guests. It was just a small gathering in Elena's backyard. Richard, Elena, her parents, and a few of her close friends. They ate cake off paper plates and watched as Christopher gleefully smeared frosting all over his face. When it was time for presents, Richard felt a familiar nervousness. He had agonized over his gift for weeks. Another expensive toy would be meaningless. A contribution to his trust fund was impersonal. He had to give something that mattered. He handed Elena a simple, beautifully wrapped box. She opened it carefully. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, were 2 worn, spiral-bound notebooks, the original Aura Connect notebooks. A hush fell over the small group. Elena stared at them, her breath catching in her throat. She looked up at Richard, her eyes wide with a question he was finally ready to answer. "They're not mine to keep," he said, his voice quiet but clear, making sure her parents could hear. "They never were. They belong to the person whose idea sparked the whole thing. They are a part of your history, Elena. And more importantly, they are a part of Christopher's history. I want him to grow up knowing the full and complete truth of where he came from. He comes from a brilliant mother who built an empire with an idea born of love and connection long before I built one out of code and ambition." He reached into his pocket and pulled out another small item, a legal document. "This is a deed of assignment," he said, handing it to her. "It's from the company. It formally and legally assigns the trademark and all associated branding goodwill for the name Aura Connect to you. It's yours, in name, in history, and now in law. It was always your aura, Elena. I just got lost in the connection." Tears welled in Elena's eyes. This was more than a gift. It was a surrender. It was the final, definitive piece of his old, arrogant self being laid to rest. He wasn't just giving back notebooks. He was giving back her story, her legacy scrubbed clean of his ego and polished with the truth. He was completing the architecture of his atonement. Her father, a stern-looking man who had barely spoken 2 words to Richard all day, stood up and put a hand on Richard's shoulder, giving it a firm, approving squeeze. Elena looked from the notebooks to Richard at the man he was becoming. The anger she had held on to for so long had dissolved, replaced by a complex, deep-seated understanding. The path of their marriage was a ruin impossible to rebuild. But perhaps from those ruins they could build something new. A partnership. A family redefined. She gave him a small, watery smile, the first genuine, unguarded smile she had given him in over a year. It was a smile that held forgiveness, acknowledgement, and a sliver of hope. "Welcome home, Richard," she said softly. And in the quiet of that simple backyard, surrounded by the remnants of a birthday party, the billionaire who had once owned the world finally truly felt like he had arrived. So what do we learn from the story of Richard and Elena Sterling? It's a powerful, raw look at the true cost of ambition when it's not anchored by loyalty and love. It shows us that real strength isn't found in a boardroom or a bank account, but in the quiet dignity of a person who knows their worth like Elena. Richard had a life that people dream of, but he almost lost the only things that could ever make him truly rich: family honor and a chance at redemption. This story is a gripping reminder that our choices create ripples we can't foresee, and sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the one that speaks the most devastating truth. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to let us know. Share it with someone who appreciates a tale of justice and consequence. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Click that notification bell so you never miss a story. We'll see you in the next video.